Hello, I'm Mark from King's College London, and I'm going to be talking about hierarchical brain parcellation with uncertainty. So what's the motivation for this work? Well, many concepts have a natural hierarchy to them, so for example the taxonomy of animals or the classification of diseases. And in computer vision we're often interested in classifying or segmenting examples of these concepts. But most deep learning approaches ignore the hierarchical structure of the problem at hand, and they just treat the problems as if they are flat instead. But there's several potential advantages to modelling this hierarchy. And if we just take a toy example here where we take a brain and we divide it into cortex and white matter, and then the cortex into the four lobes, and the white matter into corpus callosum and right and left white matter, the first advantage is potentially graceful degradation of performance. So we might have a model that says, well, I don't know which cortical lobe this is, but I do know that this is cortex. The second potential advantage is the meshing of datasets. So we might have two datasets that are labelled with different levels of granularity, but if we can merge those labels into a single hierarchy, we might be able to jointly train on them, increasing the performance of that model. And the third potential advantage is a more informative uncertainty. We're often interested in getting measures of uncertainty out from our methods, but the use of a hierarchy might allow us to provide more specific values of uncertainty, but are more specific to the exact choices being made at that level of the hierarchy. And there's been some prior work in the area of deep learning and hierarchical classification and segmentation. So first, if we look at classification, there are some loss function based approaches. And the most well known probably of these is the YOLO 9000 paper, where they predict the conditional uncertain probabilities for each level of the tree. And there are some architecture-based approaches where the hierarchy is encoded directly into the network itself. And there's been slightly less work on hierarchical segmentation. There's some loss function-based approaches like the generalized Wasserstein dice score approach. And there's some architecture-based approaches such as dynamic structured segmentation propagation networks from CVPR 2018, which were notably used last year at MICCAI to demonstrate hierarchical parcellation of the cerebellum. So these architecture-based approaches are often quite complicated and involve a lot of work to directly encode the hierarchy into the network themselves. But loss function-based approaches have the advantage of being simpler. And so if we look at the contributions of this work, they're twofold. And the first is to extend a simple loss function-based approach to hierarchical classification to hierarchical parcellation. And the second is to show how this framework can be used to obtain hierarchical uncertainty estimates. So onto the methods, and again if we use this toy tree to demonstrate the methods, if we start just with flat parcellation, if we have 6 leaf nodes in our tree here, we might have a network with weights W that's input dependent that predicts for this voxel 6 outputs, so these are the logits for that voxel, and we might optimize the weights of the network by maximizing the cross entropy between the logits and the ground truth label encoded by this C here, or the negative log softmax of the logits. And if we're interested in extending this flat method to include uncertainty, and here we're looking at modeling aleatoric spatially varying uncertainty, but this method could be extended to model epistemic uncertainty too. Then following the approach from Kendall et al. And CVPR, if we extend our network to also produce a uncertainty value per voxel, input dependent uncertainty value per voxel, then we can use that to scale our logits at that voxel, and we take the cross entropy between these scaled logits and the ground truth. And using an approximation that's outlined in this Kendall paper, we can write this as just the cross entropy between the unscaled logits scaled by the uncertainty value, with an additional log term to control the growth of the uncertainty at each voxel. And if we think about how we might extend this to hierarchical parcellation, we can model the probability of a leaf node, such as the temporal node here, as the product of conditional probabilities going up the tree times the root node probability. And here we'll always take that to be 1 and we'll neglect the root node. So our hierarchical model does just that. Our logits now, we have one value for every node in the tree. and we take the softmax over sets of siblings, so a softmax here, a softmax here, to produce these conditional probabilities, enforcing that the conditional probabilities at each branch sum to 1. And our ground truth is now a vector, so if we want to encode the temporal lobe as a ground truth, then the probability of temporal given cortex is 1, the probability of cortex given brain is 1. And we can optimize the cross-entropy between this vector and our logits separately at every branch of the tree. So we sum over I here, where I denotes the set of logits we're interested in here, and to optimize for these conditional probabilities. And if we want to extend this now to include uncertainty, we can now predict an uncertainty value for every branch in the tree. So there's 3 now in this example. And again, we can use those to scale the appropriate set of logits for each branch in the tree. And our loss function now seeks to maximize the cross entropy between these scaled logits and the true branch and the true option at every branch in the tree. And again, we can use the same approximation to rewrite this here as a scaled standard cross entropy. So up to now, we've been discussing this toy example. In this work, we actually use this much larger hierarchy. It's inspired by the hierarchy in the 2012 MICCAI Grand Parcellation Challenge. There's 6 levels to this tree. If we look at this T1 on the right here, then we can explore these 6 levels. At the first level, we divide the brain into infratentorial, supratentorial, and background. And then at the next level, we look at the different tissue types, so cerebellum, brainstem, CSF, white matter, cortex, and basal ganglia. At the next level, we can divide our labels further into the left and right hemispheres. At the next level, we divide the cortex into its different constituent lobes. And then we, at level 5, divide the cortex further into sublobes. And we also divide up the basal ganglia into more granular sections. And the final 6th level was the most granular level, and there's 151 different labels here at this level. And just some implementation details. Our core architecture is a 3D unit, implemented according to the known unit paper with 3 pooling layers, and we use separate identical decoding branches for the segmentation and uncertainty outputs. The flat network predicts outputs per leaf node, so there's 151 per voxel for the tree considered here, and 1 uncertainty value per voxel. And the hierarchical method predicts an output for each tree node, so 213 per voxel here, and 61 uncertainty values, because that's 1 uncertainty value for every branch in the tree. And we train on 1 10-cube patches using group norm and gradient accumulation to get a batch size of 3, and train for 300 epochs with early stopping. So the experiments, the data, we use almost 600 T1 weighted MRI scans from ADNI, and we produce silver standard labels for these using GIF geodesic information flows to propagate labels using multimodal input data, not just for T1s from ADNI, followed by manual QC and editing of the labels where necessary. And we divide this into 543 scans for training, and we reserve 50 of those for testing. And we test 4 models, the flat model, the flat model of uncertainty, hierarchical model, and the hierarchical model of uncertainty. And broadly, we perform 3 experiments. We compare the raw segmentation performance. We qualitatively assess the uncertainty maps, and we compare the uncertainty thresholded segmentations. So onto the results. If we look at raw segmentation performance as measured by the DICE score, we look at the 6 levels of the tree here, and the DICE scores are the average over all labels at the level of the tree, and the standard deviation is taken over all the subjects, the 50 subjects in the test set. So if we compare just the flat and hierarchical models on the left here, we can see that the flat model slightly outperforms the hierarchical model. It's not by much, so we've got 0.861 DICE for the flat model, and the most granular level versus 0.848 for the hierarchical model. And we should note that this is a strong baseline. Previous published work using this data set, I think, gets up to about 0.848, so we're confident this is a good baseline. The story changes slightly if we start incorporating uncertainty into our models. Here, at the most granular levels, the hierarchical method starts to slightly outperform the flat method, but again, the differences are small. We think the reason here is that empirically we've noticed for hierarchical method with uncertainty is much easier to optimize than the flat uncertainty method. To get the flat method to train successfully, you need to carefully tune parameters. So for example, use gradient clipping and things like that. And the hierarchical method seems much more forgiving about the kind of training parameters. And so we think it's converging better, though that needs exploring a bit further. And now if we look at the total uncertainty from the two methods, so the flat uncertainty, we just get a single uncertainty method per voxel here, and that's plotted here. And we can get the total uncertainty from the hierarchical method by taking the mean across the 61 values per voxel here. And we can see that just looking at these broad overall uncertainty maps, that they're similar. They're picking up uncertainty roughly in the same regions and similar sorts of edges. But the hierarchical method has all this extra information. We've got information for the uncertainty at every branching point. So I'll just demonstrate that here. So if we look at using the method to predict one of the cortical lobes on a subject in the test set, and we go from the cranium straight to the cortical lobe, and we'll show both the segmentations and the associated uncertainty for each level. So the first level we divide up into supra-infratentorial and background, and we can see the parcellations here and the associated uncertainty, which is kind of centrally concentrated around the edges. At the next level, we divide our supratentorial up into white matter cortex, basal ganglia, and CSF. And the uncertainty here is, again, centrally concentrated around the edges. So particularly there's uncertainty around the cortical edges, and there's some uncertainty between the CSF and the basal ganglia and white matter. And at the next level, we divide the cortex into left and right hemispheres. And this is quite easy to do, so there's less uncertainty. And what uncertainty there is, you can see, is concentrated along the boundaries between these two hemispheres. And then we take the left cortex and we divide up into the lobes. And here we can see there's much more uncertainty and it's more spread out. It might be slightly difficult to see here because of the colour scheme, but there are different lobes here. They're just similar shades of red. And this uncertainty is localized along the boundaries of those different lobes. But it's spread out because this is a difficult problem. Experts labeling this would disagree on exactly where the boundaries were between these different lobes, and that's being reflected by the network's uncertainty output here. And then we divide up the frontal lobe into further into sublobes, and again the uncertainty is sensibly distributed along boundaries between these lobes. And then we segment the final lobe here. And the uncertainty, there's little uncertainty, but if we flip back a side, we can see that the lobe we're actually predicting here is separated from the others, at least on the view we're showing here. So there isn't much uncertainty between that lobe and the others. And now we'll show a final example of what we could do with this hierarchical uncertainty. So imagine we're interested in predicting and getting the cortex from the subject and getting the cortical volume and lower and upper bounds of that volume to use as some sort of biomarker in downstream analysis. So we might want to use our network's uncertainty output to get kind of lower and upper bound estimates for the cortex by thresholding the segmentation, so thresholding based on different values of uncertainty. If we're to do that with a flat network, well, we've only got one uncertainty value per voxel here, and some of that uncertainty encodes, for example, uncertainty between different cortical sublobes. So if we use that to threshold the cortical map, it doesn't work very well. We get no cortex here in this kind of on the thresholding on the left here. Whereas using the hierarchical method, we can get a cortical specific uncertainty by taking uncertainty from the right branch of the tree, and we can take our map and we can use it to threshold the segmentation, and we can get a more sensible looking lower and upper bound for what the cortical parcellation should look like. If we wanted to obtain that using the flat method, we'd have to retrain a cortical specific parcellation model so that we can get appropriate uncertainty values around the cortical edges. So just to conclude, we've introduced a simple method of performing hierarchical parcellation here based on a loss function-based method for hierarchical classification. We've shown the performance is similar to that of the flat method. It's slightly worse without uncertainty, slightly better with uncertainty. But the key thing here is that it opens up a number of possibilities, such as graceful performance degradation, training jointly on multiple data sets, and the hierarchical understanding of uncertainties. And we've demonstrated the latter here, but in future work we'll investigate on applications of the other two as well. So that's everything, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.